Tonight, you're going somewhere very few people have ever been. Not a country, not a city, not a landscape you could find on any modern map. You are going to a place that existed at the edge of the human world and the divine one, a threshold, a border crossing between what people knew and what they could only dream. You are going to sleep inside an ancient Egyptian temple, not as a tourist, not as an archaeologist brushing sand from a buried floor. You're going as someone who belongs there, as someone who has prepared for this night for years, who has learned the prayers and the rituals and the precise way to fold white linen, who understands in the marrow of their bones that what happens when you close your eyes in this place is not the same as sleep anywhere else on earth. In this place, sleep is a doorway. Before we step through it, take a moment to settle wherever you are right now. Feel the wet surface beneath you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands rest open, palms upward, the way the priests used to rest theirs when they are waiting for something to be given. If you enjoy what we do here at The Quiet Adult, consider subscribing. And if you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, drop your location and the time in the comments. There is something extraordinary about knowing that people on opposite sides of the planet are falling asleep at the same moment, drifting into the same ancient darkness. Now, dim the lights, slow your breathing, and come with me to a desert evening 3,000 years ago, where a temple rises from the flat earth like a dream someone has refused to forget. The sun is going down over the Nile. You have watched it go down many times from this place, but it never becomes ordinary. The sky turns the color of heated copper, then deepens into something closer to blood, then softens, finally, into a bruised and illuminous violet that seems to pulse faintly as though the sky itself is breathing. The river below catches the last light. It holds it for a moment, the way still water holds a reflection longer than it should, reluctant to let go. And then the colors fade. The first star appears, sharp as pinpricks in dark cloth, and the temple behind you, the temple you have lived beside for most of your adult life, begins to change. During the day, the temple is monumental, imposing. The pylons that form its entrance gates stand taller than 20 men stacked upon one another. Their surfaces are covered in carved reliefs painted in colors so vivid they seem almost aggressive in the Egyptian sun, red and gold, and a blue so deep it makes the sky above look pale. The pharaoh is depicted there, enormous, smiting enemies with a raised arm that has been frozen in stone for centuries. Gods receive offerings. Processions move in solemn, carved silence around the walls forever. During the day, the temple speaks the language of power, of permanence, of a civilization so confident in its own significance that it carved its story into stone rather than writing it on papyrus that might decay. It announces itself, it commands. But at dusk, the temple changes its voice. The hard edges soften. The painted figures on the walls lose their colors, the shadow, and become something more ambiguous, more ancient feeling, as though by losing their colors they have shed something artificial and revealed what they always were underneath. The pylons no longer look like architecture, they look like what the Egyptians always said they were, the two mountains between which the sun set and rose, the horizon itself made solid, the gateway between the world of the living and the world of whatever came before and after living. You stand at the outer edge of the temple precinct, just be inside the mud brick enclosure wall that surrounds the sacred ground, and you feel the day leaving you the way warmth leaves a stone. You have spent the day in service. That is what a priest's life is at its core, a life of service, though not the service most people imagine when they think of the word. You have not been tending to worshippers. You have not been offering counsel or comfort to ordinary people with ordinary problems. The temple is not in the way many modern people conceive of religious buildings, a place where the congregation gathers. The temple is a home, the home of the God, and your role, your precise and sacred and carefully delineated role, is that of a servant in that home, a servant of extraordinary privilege and equally extraordinary responsibility. Your days are structured around the needs of a divine resident who requires bathing and dressing and feeding and the correct prayers spoken at the correct hours in the correct sequence without omission, without error, without the contamination of impure thought or impure body. You have been bathing in the sacred lake within the temple precinct multiple times each day. Cold water, the same water that connects symbolically to the primordial ocean from which the Egyptians believed all life first emerged. You have shaved your head and your body completely because hair harbors impurity, and impurity in this place is not merely an inconvenience. It is a transgression against something so vast and so old that the imagination struggles to hold it. You have been chewing natron, a naturally occurring salt that the Egyptians used for purification, the same substance used in the preservation of the dead, which tells you something about how seriously they took the boundary between the clean and the unclean. You have worn white linen, only white linen for the entire day, because white is the color of purity, the color of the moon on still water, the color of the ibis feather and the god Thoth used to write the names of the dead. All of this, the bathing, the shaving, the natron, and the linen, is preparation, not just for the rituals of the day, for tonight, because tonight you will sleep inside the temple. This is not everyday priest's experience. The temples of ancient Egypt contain multitudes. There were priests who served in rotation, spending a month on duty and then returning to their ordinary lives outside the sacred precinct, living with their families, eating ordinary food, wearing ordinary clothes. They were called web priests, the pure ones, and while their duties were genuine and important, they were, in the hierarchy of temple life, the outer circle. Then there were those who lived permanently within the temple's world, who had, over years and sometimes decades of service, moved inward, passed through the successive degrees of knowledge and ritual purity, earned the right, or perhaps the burden is the more honest word of proximity to the divine. You are one of those. And tonight, as the last color drains from the western sky and the stars consolidate their positions in the dark, you will walk deeper into this building than most people who serve here will ever go. You will sleep in a chamber where the stones have absorbed centuries of incense, smoke, and prayer, where the silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older than sound, where the boundary between your dreaming mind and whatever moves through this place at night becomes, in the language of the ancient Egyptians, beautifully, terrifyingly thin. Historians who have spent their careers studying ancient Egyptian religious practices still debate the precise nature of what happened during temple sleep. The practice the Greeks called incubation, from their own encounter with similar traditions, involved sleeping in a sacred place with the specific intention of receiving a divine communication through dreams. It was widespread in the ancient world, practiced at the temples of Asclepius in Greece, at oracle sites across the Mediterranean, at shrines and sacred groves from Britain to Mesopotamia. But the Egyptian version was something older and arguably stranger than most. Because for the Egyptians, the temple itself were not merely a sacred place. It was a cosmological machine, a physical model of the universe as they understood it. Every chamber, every doorway, every carved inscription served a function in a vast and precisely engineered system designed to maintain the order of creation itself. The word they used for this order was ma'at. It meant truth, justice, balance, the correct functioning of all things. The planets in their orbits, the Nile in its annual flood, the sun rising and setting without failure, the crops growing, the dead going to their proper place. All of it, all of the vast, complex, terrifying business of existence depended on Ma'at being maintained, and the temples were the engines that maintained it. To sleep inside such a place was not a small thing. It was an act of profound trust and profound vulnerability. You were placing your unconscious mind, the part of you that you could not control or censor, inside a machine built to communicate with forces that existed at a scale the waking mind could barely conceptualize. The priests understood this, and it is why the preparation mattered so much. You were not simply lying down to rest, you were making yourself available, opening something, submitting the deepest, most unguarded part of yourself to whatever wished to speak. Let us slow down here and stay with the preparation for a while, because the Egyptian understanding of the world, the preparation was not separate from the experience. It was the first part of it. Imagine yourself moving through the late afternoon temple precinct. The sacred lake is to your left, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the sky in a rectangle of captured light. The lake is artificial, constructed by human hands, but it is fed by groundwater that the Egyptians understood as a connection to the Nun, the primordial waters that existed before the first act of creation. To bathe in it is to touch the beginning of things. You descend the steps to the water's edge. The steps are broad and shallow, worn smooth by decades of feet. The stone is warm near the surface where the sun has been all of day. But as your feet go deeper, The warmth gives way to coolness, and then to a cold that the Egyptian sun can never quite reach, a cold that belongs to the earth and the dark water beneath it. You lower yourself in. The water closes over your shoulders. You feel your breath change, the cold demanding attention, pulling you out of any mental wandering and into the immediate fact of your body. The priests understood this. The cold water was not incidental to the purification. It was the mechanism. The shock of it, mild but real, interrupted the ordinary stream of thought and created a gap, a moment of pure sensation. And in that gap, if you had trained yourself to find it, something settled. You submerge completely. The world above the water becomes a wavering, diffuse light. The sounds of the temple precinct, a distant call, the movement of sandals on stone, the wind in the papyrus beds along the outer wall become muffled, and then something more than muffled. They become remote, as though they belong to a world you have temporarily left. You surface, you stand in the lake for a moment, water running from your shaved head, your white linen clinging to your skin, and you say the words of purification. They are words you have said so many times that they have moved past the realm of recitation and into something closer to the functioning of the breath itself. Automatic, essential. The prayers do not require conscious effort any more than your heart requires conscious instruction to beat. This is something that scholars of Egyptian religion have noted with fascination. The repetitive nature of Egyptian ritual, the same prayers, the same gestures, the same sequence of actions performed day after day, year after year, across centuries, was not, as it might first appear to a modern observer, a sign of rigid thoughtlessness. It was a technology. Repetition in sacred context does something to the mind that novelty cannot. It wears grooves. It creates pathways that become, over time, so established that the conscious, analytical part of the mind can release its grip and something else, something quieter and more receptive can come forward. The priests were, among other things, specialists in the alteration of consciousness through repetitive, sacred practice. And every bath, every prayer, every carefully folded length of white linen was part of a system designed to produce a particular state of mind by the time the night came and the temple closed its doors. You climb the steps from the lake. A junior priest hands you a length of clean linen. You dry yourself and dress again in fresh white robes. The linen so finely woven that in direct light it is almost transparent. The weave so tight and even that it feels less like cloth and more like a second skin, cool and smooth and slightly formal. The way a ceremonial garment always feels slightly formal, as though it knows what it is for. Your head is shaved. This is worth pausing on because it is so different from what most modern people associate with spiritual practice. We tend to associate long hair, flowing robes, the organic and the untrimmed with holiness. The Egyptians taught precisely the opposite. Hair was a site of impurity. It collected sweat, dust, the invisible traces of the world. The shave was to reduce the surface area of contamination, to present to the god a body that was as clean and unencumbered as possible. There's something interesting here about the Egyptian understanding of the body itself. The body was not, as it became in many later religious traditions, a source of shame or a prison for the soul. It was an instrument. It had to be kept clean and correctly maintained, not because it was bad, but because it was the vehicle through which communication with the divine happened. A poorly maintained instrument produced poor music. A properly maintained one could produce something transcendent. Your eyes are lined with coal. This is not vanity. Coal, made from ground galena or malachite, had genuine antibacterial properties that protected the eyes from the infections that were common in the Nile Valley. But in the ritual context, it will also mark the eyes as consecrated, as organs of sacred seeing, capable of perceiving what ordinary unlined eyes might miss. You apply a small amount of resinous oil to your wrists and at the base of your throat. The oil is scented with kipi, the temple incense blend that was one of the most guarded formulations in Egypt. Different temples have their own recipes, but all kipi contain substances, including in some versions, small amounts of psychoactive materials from plants like blue lotus that were understood to facilitate the kind of receptive, open mental state needed for effective ritual and effective dreaming. The smell of kipi is unlike any modern perfume. It is sweet but also resinous and deep, with a base note of something ancient and slightly overwhelming. The way all truly old things have a quality in their presence that newer things lack. Raisins and honey and cinnamon and myrrh and raisins from trees that no longer grow in the same abundance anywhere on earth. When you smell it, something in you that is older than your personal history responds. You eat your final meal of the day. The diet of a priest in active sacred service was restricted and specific. No fish. Fish were associated with the chaotic, unordered forces that the temple worked to hold at bay. No garlic or onions, whose strong smell was considered incompatible with the refined sensory environment of the divine house. Bread made from emmer wheat, specific cuts of roasted meat that had been offered to the god and then redistributed to the priests. Beer that had been brewed within the temple precinct itself. The meal is quiet, taken in a small room off the main processional axis with the other priests who are also preparing for the night. The conversation, when there is any, is slow and careful. There are things you do not speak of on nights like this: the ordinary business of life, the flooding of a field, the price of linen in the market, the health of a relative belongs to a different world. Tonight, that world is further away than it usually feels. After the meal, more prayers, a sequence of hymns to the setting sun, and the dying of the light understood not as an ending but as a transformation. The sun god Ra entering the underworld, traveling through its 12 hours of darkness in his bark, encountering and overcoming the forces of dissolution, emerging transformed at dawn. This nightly journey was one of the central structuring of myths of Egyptian religious life, and to understand it, to feel as more than metaphor, the priests had to be willing to make their own version of the same journey into the dark, through the hours, trusting the emergence. Sleep, for the ancient Egyptians, was not incidental to this mythology, it was a structural part of it. The moment of falling asleep was understood as a small death, The moment of waking, a small resurrection. Every night, every ordinary person who closed their eyes and lost consciousness, which was, in Egyptian cosmological terms, making the journey that Ra made in the bark, passing through darkness, encountering the contents of their own underworld, emerging, if they were fortunate, with something they had not had before. For the priests, this was not metaphor, it was function, it was their work. The temple has a geography that mirrors the geography of consciousness itself. Stand at the entrance pylons and look inward, and what you see is a sequence of spaces, each one smaller and darker than the last, each one requiring a higher degree of preparation and purity to enter, each one holding a more concentrated version of whatever it is that the temple contains. The outermost space is the open courtyard. In the great temples of Karnak or Luxor, these courtyards were enormous, large enough to contain a modern sports stadium. Their floor space broken by avenues of columns and statues, open to the sky, flooded with light during the day. This was the most public part of the temple, the zone where ordinary people on certain festival days were permitted to approach, to present offerings at of the shrine, to petition the god through the intermediary of the priests. But even here, in this most accessible space, there was a quality of atmosphere that distinguished it from the ordinary world outside the enclosure wall. The walls were high enough to block the wind. Sound moved and behaved differently. The ambient noise of the outside world, the calls of water birds along the river, the sound of the city or the village that lived in the temple's shadow, all of it was muted, filtered, reduced to something more distant and less insistent than it was just a few steps away from beyond the gate. The air smelled differently, not just because of the incense, though incense was burned at regular intervals throughout the day, and its smoke had settled into every porous surface in the complex over centuries. There was something else, a coolness that had nothing entirely to do with shade, a quality of stillness that you could feel on your skin. The outer courtyard was where the junior priests and the lay servants of the temple slept on nights when their duties required their presence within the precinct. They did not have chambers. They slept on reed mats rolled on out on the stone floor or on low wooden platforms set against the courtyard walls. They slept in groups, the warmth of proximity serving as a partial remedy for the cold that descended upon the desert night, with a swiftness that always surprised the people who had not experienced it. The Egyptian desert at night is not what most people imagine. During the day, the heat is absolute and merciless, a physical weight pressing down on everything beneath it. But the desert holds no moisture, and without moisture in the air, the heat does not linger after dark. It releases. The temperature can drop 20 degrees in an hour after sunset. By the deepest hours of the night, in the winter months, the outer courts of the temple could be genuinely cold, a damp cold rising from the stone floor and a dry cold descending from a sky that blazed with stars that it never blazed in the humid delta cities. The junior priests adapted. They wore their robes layered, the outer linen supplemented with heavier woolen cloth that was technically less pure but practically necessary. They slept close together. They kept small braziers burning at the corners of the courtyard. The coals banked low to last through the night, providing warmth and the continued presence of the sacred fire that was never allowed to go completely out. There's something tender, about imagining these young men because they were mostly young, sleeping on stone under a sky so dense. With stars, it looked solid, breathing cold air scented with incense, and the distant river, their shaved heads reflecting of the moonlight. They had come from all parts of Egypt, from farming families who had noticed that the sun seemed drawn to the sacred, who had the quality of stillness that the temples required, from established priestly dynasties where service was inherited along with the knowledge of the prayers, from the palace itself, where the particularly intelligent or spiritually gifted children were sometimes dedicated to temple service. They had all given up something to be here. The fishing village boy who had given up the familiar smell of the Nile mud and the sound of nets being thrown at dawn, the farmer's son who had given up the season rhythms of the agricultural year that had structured his family's life for generations. All of them had given up the easy intimacy of ordinary social life, the unguarded conversations, and the uncomfortable noise of daily human existence. In exchange, they had this, a courtyard under the most beautiful sky on earth, the sense of participating in something so much larger than themselves that personal ambition became, in its presence, almost comically small, and the slow accumulating, almost geological quality of belonging that comes from living inside a structure of meaning that had, has endured far longer than any individual life can comprehend. Scholars who study ancient Egyptian social history note that the temples were, among their many other functions, one of the most sophisticated educational institutions the ancient world produced. The house of life, the Per Ankh, was the scriptorium and the library attached to the great temples, where medical knowledge, astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, literary composition, and religious instruction were all maintained and transmitted. To enter the temple service was, in a real sense, to enter the most advanced intellectual environment available to the ancient world. The young priests sleeping in the outer courtyard were not merely performing ritual duties, they were being educated. The prayers they memorized contained embedded within them information about the movement of celestial bodies, about the properties of plants and minerals, about the structure of the human body and the nature of its diseases, about the geography of the afterlife as the Egyptians conceptualized it, about the mathematics of proportion that governed the temple's construction and the proportion of the universe itself. Every night of sleeping in the courtyard, every cold early morning rising before dawn to perform the first ritual of the day was part of a process of formation that could take decades. The outer court was the beginning, and for most who began there, it was the end. Most priests spend their service lives in the outer precincts. They performed their duties with care and genuine devotion. They slept on stone and rose before dawn and never passed through the doorways that led inward, not because they were forbidden exactly, because they had not yet become what was required to enter. The transition from one level to the next was not purely administrative. It was not simply a matter of seniority or study, though both mattered. It required something harder to define and harder to acquire, a quality that the Egyptians described in various ways in their texts, a readiness, a receptivity, a capacity for stillness so complete that the noise of the individual self became genuinely quiet enough for the something else to be heard. Some priests worked toward this for decades and never arrived. Others arrived young and surprised their teachers. Let your own body settle now into whatever surface it is holding. Feel the weight of yourself. Feel the way the gravity is in this moment doing all the work. You do not have to hold anything up. You do not have to manage anything. The surface beneath you is adequate. It is enough. Like the stone of the temple courtyard, it simply receives you without judgment, without expectation. Let your breathing slow. In the courtyard, the young priests are breathing slowly now. Their braziers glow at the corners. Their stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the same patterns the priests have memorized as part of their training, because the stars told time in Egypt, and the stars told season, and the stars told the position of the soul in the afterlife, and the stars were written language of the sky gods who moved through the heavens in their boats of light. Somewhere in the temple, a lamp is burning, a single flame maintained by the most senior priest on night duty, kept alive because to let the sacred flame go out would be to make, in the most literal physical sense, a darkness where no darkness was permitted. The outer court sleepers cannot see the flame, but they know it is there, and knowing it is there in itself a kind of warmth. Here is something that most people do not know about the ancient world. For thousands of years, across dozens of cultures, in temples and shrines and sacred caves from one end of the inhabited earth to the other, people understood that the human mind in the state of sleep was capable of receiving information that the waking mind could not access. This was not considered supernatural exactly, in the way that modern people tend to use that word to mean something that violates the laws of nature. For the ancient Egyptians, the capacity to receive divine communication through dreams was simply a feature of human consciousness, a capability built into the design, like the capacity for language or for mathematical reasoning. It existed in everyone, but like those capacities, it could be cultivated, trained, directed, and refined. The practice of sleeping in a sacred place in order to receive a healing dream or divine message or an answer to an urgent question is what scholars call incubation. The word comes from the Latin incubar, meaning to lie upon, and while the Latin word came later, the practice itself is Egyptian in its most ancient documented forms. The Egyptians called the dream Ruminant Har, the voice of the night, or the Mao, some which carried the sense of vision of seeing. The god most closely associated with dream communication was Bes, the strange dwarf deity with the leonine face and the protruding tongue, who was believed to stand guard over the vulnerable sleeping body, warding off malevolent forces while the soul went wandering. Images of Bes were carved into the headboards of sleeping platforms and painted on the walls of sleeping chambers throughout Egypt, from the grandest palace to the most modest village home. But the dreams that were sought in the temple incubation were of a different order than the ordinary dreams that Bes protected. These were not the residue of daily concerns, the mind processing the events of the day in the strange compressed language of the unconscious. These were intentional communications from the divine, sought deliberately, prepared for carefully, and received in a state of mind that the had been shaped over the days or weeks or sometimes much longer into something genuinely receptive. People came from extraordinary distances to undertake this practice. There are papyri that recorded the journeys of individuals who walked for weeks across the desert, who traveled by boat down the Nile from the far south or up from the delta, who came with offerings and petitions and the kind of focused, single pointed intention that comes from having decided that the ordinary means have been exhausted and something else must be tried. They came with specific questions. A woman who had been unable to conceive a child came to sleep at the temple of Hathor, whose domain included fertility, and asked in her sleeping prayers to be shown the obstacle, or to be given the remedy, or simply to be told whether hope remained. A man whose business had failed came to sleep at the temple of Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, and asked to be shown the error in his thinking. A soldier came the night before battle to sleep near the shrine of Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess, and asked to be given the courage or strategy, or at the very least to know in advance the outcome that fate has already decided. The preparations for incubation varied by temple and by the specific deity being petitioned, but certain elements were consistent across the tradition. The seeker had to be ritually pure. This meant bathing, fasting, or eating only specific foods, abstaining from sexual activity, and in many cases, spending several days in the outer precincts of the temple before being permitted to approach the inner zones where the incubation would take place. The period of preparation served a purpose that is, from a modern psychological perspective, remarkably well understood. By the time a person had spent several days in ritual purification, eating little, sleeping on hard stone, waking before dawn for prayers, their ordinary state of consciousness had been substantially altered, not in a dramatic or disorienting way, but in the way that sustained contemplative practice of any kind alters consciousness, gradually, almost imperceptibly, but cumulatively and profoundly. The analytical, problem solving, self protective layers of the mind, the parts that spend most of their energies managing the ordinary social and practical demands of our daily life, had been gently but persistently set aside. What remained was something quieter, something more open, something that was in the language that Jung would use these 3,000 years later, closer to the deeper structures of the psyche, less insulated from the contents of the unconscious by the noise of conscious activity. This is the part that most fascinates modern researchers who study the phenomenon. The Egyptians had, without the conceptual vocabulary of modern deaf psychology, developed a practical technology that for achieving the precise mental state that contemporary sleep researchers described as hypnagogic, the threshold state between waking and sleeping, where the analytical mind is sufficiently disengaged for images and ideas form deeper levels of consciousness to surface. They have been refining this technology for over 2,000 years before the Greeks encountered it and were struck enough by its effectiveness to adopt it into their own religious practice. These are records, dream papyri, they are called, preserved from temple archives that document the content of incubatory dreams. They are extraordinary documents. They speak in a language that is at once completely alien and completely recognizable. The symbols are Egyptian, gods with animal heads, the specific iconography of the waving of the heart, the boat of the sun navigating the river of the underworld. But the structures are universal. The sudden appearance of a figure of authority who speaks a word of guidance, the encounter with an animal that leads to the dreamer to a location, this experience of being given something, a gift whose meaning must be interpreted but whose emotional weight is unmistakable, the feeling upon waking that something genuine has been communicated, that the barrier between the ordinary and the extraordinary has been briefly and sufficiently dissolved. Scholars continue to debate the epistemological status of these dreams. Were they genuinely revelatory in any sense that a materialist framework would recognize? Were they primarily therapeutic, the product of a period of rest and quiet and focused intention that allowed the dreamer's own deep intelligence to surface? Were they culturally constructed, the mind producing in obedient response to expectation, the kinds of images and narratives that the tradition had trained it to expect? The debate is unresolved and perhaps unresolvable with the evidence available. But what is clear from the historical record is that the practice worked in whatever sense that the word applies. People who came to the temples in desperation left changed. The dreams they were received were specific enough to be actionable, meaningful enough to be transformative, and consistent enough across different dreamers and different temples to suggest that something real, if not straightforwardly explicable, was occurring. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is the one that the Egyptians themselves have already reached 3,000 years ago, that the sleeping human mind, placed in the right conditions, is capable of things that the waking mind is not. Now you are moving deeper. You have passed through the outer courtyard. You have passed through the second pylon, the second pair of monumental gate towers, and now you're standing at the hypostyle hall. You stop because the hypostyle hall always makes you stop, no matter how many times you have entered it. The word hypostyle means resting on pillars. It is inadequate to what this space actually is. Imagine a forest made of stone, not a grove, a forest. In the largest temples, the hypostyle hall contains more than 100 columns, each one 12 to 20 meters tall, each one thicker than several people could encircle with their linked arms, each one carved from floor to summit with inscriptions and images so dense and so intricate that a scholar could spend a lifetime reading a single column and still find new meanings. The columns are not uniform. The ones along the central processional axis are the tallest, their capitals carved in the form of open papyrus flowers, the papyrus being a plant of the Nile marshes, a plant that grew from the primordial waters, a plant whose very shape in with its bundled stems bursting upon upward into an explosion of growth captured the Egyptian idea of creative emergence, of life exerting itself out of undifferentiated water. The columns on either side of this are slightly shorter, their capitals closed, like papyrus buds not yet open. The difference in height creates a clerestory, a zone near the ceiling where the central row of columns rises above the flanking rows, and where the stone screens with geometric openings allow light to enter. During the day, this light is extraordinary. Shafts of it fall through the screens at angles that shift through the hours, moving across the column surfaces in a slow procession that the priests read as part of the temple's ongoing declaration of solar theology. The light that enters the hypostyle hall is not just illumination, it is the presence of Ra, the sun god, moving through his house. But you are not here during the day. It is midnight. The moon is up, and some of its light filters through the clerestory screens, pale and silver and insufficient for reading, but sufficient for moving. The columns emerge from the darkness like the trunk of enormous trees in a night forest, their surfaces almost luminous, where the moonlight catches the raised relief of the carvings, their depths completely black. The shadows between the columns are not ordinary shadows. They are not simply the absence of light. They have a texture to them, a density, as though they are made of something more substantial than darkness. When you have moved through them, you feel them against your skin, a slight resistance, a coolness that is more than temperature. The sound of the hypostyle hall at midnight is unlike the sound anywhere else. The columns and the stone ceiling and the stone floor create an acoustic environment of profound complexity. A single sound, a footstep, a softly spoken word, the drip of water from libation vessel not quite emptied, will reflect and re-reflect between the stone surfaces, creating a reverberation that lasts far longer than it should, that seems to multiply and deepen as it bounces, that arrives at your ears from directions that do not correspond to where the sound originated. The effect is not disorienting exactly, but it is deeply, fundamentally strange. It tells the part of your brain responsible for spatial orientation from the normal rules do not apply here. That sound and space are behaving according to principles that your ordinary experience has not prepared you for. The priests understood this effect, they used it. The chanting that occurred in the hypostyle hall at specific hours of the night was calculated to produce particular acoustic phenomena. Harmonics that emerged from the interaction of multiple voices with the stone geometry of a space, overtones that hovered above the fundamental notes of the chant like a presence accompanying the music, a choir made of physics rather than breath. There is evidence from recent acoustic archaeologist research that the ancient Egyptians were acutely aware of the sound properties of their sacred spaces, and that the design of the hypostyle hall was not merely structural or aesthetic but deliberately acoustic. The columns were not simply holding up the ceiling, they were instruments. You move through the hall slowly. Your sandals on the stone floor produce a sound that columns multiply and return to you, so that each step seemed accompanied. You are not alone here in any simple sense. You are never alone in a space that does this to sound. The incense smoke from the braziers placed at intervals along the processional axis hangs in the air at shoulder height, visible in the moonlight as a layer of luminous haze. Below it is the air is cooler and clearer. Above it, thicker and sweeter. The accumulated breath of a day of ritual condensed into something you could almost drink. You pass a side chapel, its entrance flanked by two standing figures of the god carved in black granite. The figures were painted, or were painted. Some of the pigment had been renewed so many times over the centuries that the surface has built up a quality of depth, like light coming through the colored glass rather than reflected from a flat surface. The god's eyes, inlaid with obsidian and electrum, catch the moonlight. You do not look quite directly at the figure. This is not fear. It is a trained sensitivity, an acknowledgement that certain things are perceived better with peripheral vision than with direct attention. The priests were taught this from their earliest training, that the divine was often most clearly seen when you were not trying to see it, that approaching it directly, frontally, with the full force of conscious attention was a way of making it disappear. This has something in common with the experience of falling asleep. The harder you try to sleep, the more elusive it becomes. It requires the kind of relaxation of intentionality, a willingness to stop managing the process and simply allow it. The priests practiced this in their approach to the divine, and in doing so, they practiced something very close to what we now understand to be optimal sleep hygiene, though arrived at from a completely different direction. You pause in the middle of the hypostyle hall. You stand still and let the space hold you. The sound of your own breathing seems very loud. Then, as you stay still, it seems to be become part of the acoustic environment of the hall itself, joining at the faint whisper of air moving through the clerestory screens. The distant sound of the now, the almost inaudible settling of the stone cooling of the day's heat. You are breathing and the hall is breathing, and the difference between the two is, in this moment, less clear than it usually is. This is the threshold of the effect of the hypostyle hall. This is what it is designed to do, to move you from the state of mind appropriate for the outer courtyard, alert, socially present, capable of ordinary perception and ordinary relationships, to the state of mind appropriate for what lies beyond. The columns stand around you like teachers who have said everything they have had to say and are now waiting for you to understand it. You breathe. You let the moonlight and the incense smoke and the extraordinary acoustic space do what it has been doing to human nervous systems for 2,500 years. You let yourself become just slightly less solid. Beyond the hypostyle hall, there is a sequence of smaller rooms, each one darker from than the last, each one smaller, each one more completely enclosed by stone. This is deliberate by architecture of the psyche. The ancient Egyptians understood something about the relationship between the external environment and the internal state of the human being that the most architectural traditions either do not understand or choose to ignore. They understood that the spaces we inhabit shape what we are able to feel, think, and perceive, that a vast and brightly lit space encourages a certain kind of consciousness, expansive, socially oriented, capable of grand gesture and public declaration, that a small and dark and quiet space encourages a completely different kind, inward, receptive, capable of fine discrimination between subtle states. They built both kinds of space and they placed them in sequence so that the person moving through the temple was also moving through the sequence of states, a graduated transformation from the ordinary world of sunlight and social transaction to the extraordinary world of the gods' most intimate presence. You pass through the hall of offerings, a room whose walls are covered floor to ceiling with carved lists of things that have been presented to the god: bread and beer and oil and linen and cattle and incense and flowers and the daily rounds of sustenance, a bureaucratic inventory of devotion that is also a kind of prayer, a declaration that nothing has been forgotten, and that the accounts between human and divine are current and balanced. You pass through the vestibule, a transitional space that functions as an airlock between the outer and inner zones of the temple. The priests who enter here must pause and recite specific words that acknowledge the transition, that declare the self as clean and intentional, that asks permission, not in a servile way, but in the way one asks permission of any great and genuine power, out of respect for the reality of what it is. And then you are in the sanctuary. The word does not capture it. Sanctuary is too soft a word, too associated with refuge and comfort. The Egyptian equivalent, the jet, was understood not as a place of shelter, but as a place of presence, the presence of the God, concentrated and held in the darkness the way heat is held in a stone that has been in the sun all day, slowly accumulated, gradually released, the warmth arriving at your hands before you even touch the surface. The sanctuary is small, in proportion to the vast forecourt and the forest of the hypostyle hall. It is almost shockingly small, a room perhaps 5 meters wide and 7 meters long, with a ceiling so low that a tall person must lower their head. The walls are covered in inscriptions so dense and there is almost no bare stone visible. Text and image covering almost every surface from floor to ceiling. The entire myth of the god present on the walls of the god's house, the divine biography rendered in the most permanent medium available to human hands. At the far end of the sanctuary is the naos. The naos is a shrine, a box made of granite or hard limestone, or in the most important temples of Electrum, the alloy of gold and silver that the Egyptians associated with starlight. Inside the naos is the statue of the god, not a symbol of the god, not a representation. The Egyptians were careful and precise about this distinction in a way that has sometimes been misunderstood. The statue was understood as a vehicle for the divine presence, a form in which the god has consented to be localized, made available for relationship with human beings in a way that the god's full nature could not be. The naos is closed. It is opened only during specific rituals performed at specific hours. At midnight, at the hour when you have come to sleep, it is shut, its cedar doors sealed with clay, bearing the impression of the priest's ring, the seal a declaration that has nothing has disturbed the god's private rest. For the god, the texts tell us, also sleeps. This is one of the stranger and more beautiful ideas in Egyptian theology. The gods were not conceived as omnipresent, inexhaustible, infinitely available. They had rhythms, periods of activity and periods of rest. The god who entered the naos at the end of the evening ritual was, in the theological understanding that structured temple practice, genuinely resting, genuinely withdrawn from the world into a privacy that was not entirely different from the privacy of sleep. And the priest who came to sleep in the sanctuary was not intruding on that privacy. He was participating in it. He was making himself available to whatever the divine mind produced in its own dreaming. The gods, after all, were not imagined as without interior life, without the movement of thought and image and memory that constitutes the inner experience of a being that is genuinely alive. You spread your reed mat on the stone floor of the sanctuary. The mat is clean and freshly made, its reeds still smelling faintly of the river. You have brought a single small oil lamp, which you set in a niche in the wall, its flame so small that it barely disturbs the darkness. The sanctuary at midnight is as dark as any place on earth that has a lamp in it can be. The darkness is not absolute, but it is very close to absolute. With the small flame, it seems like an illumination than a gesture, a declaration of presence in an environment that is defined by its depth and its quiet. You lie down on the mat. The stone beneath the mat is cool, not the deep cool of the desert night that reached into the outer courtyard. The sanctuary is so enclosed by stone that the external temperature barely penetrates it. The coolness here is internal to the building. The thermal mass of all the accumulated stone maintaining a temperature that belongs to neither a day nor night, but to some third condition, some baseline of the earth itself. You lie on your back, the way the priests are taught to lie for incubatory sleep, arms at your sides, palms upward and open, the position of reception. Eyes open for now, looking up at the ceiling, which is painted in deep lapis blue, scattered with gold stars. The sky above the Egypt rendered in the most permanent and beautiful form that human craftsmanship could achieve, so that the priest sleeping beneath it was always technically sleeping under the open sky, under the stars that the soul would navigate on its journey through the afterlife. The stars on the ceiling are the actual stars of the Egyptian sky, the specific constellations that were visible from the Nile Valley, rendered with an astronomical accuracy that the researchers have only recently fully appreciated. You know these stars. You have memorized their names and their mythological identities as part of your training. You can look up this painted ceiling and orient yourself in the cosmos the way a sailor orients himself by the real sky. A lamp flame in its niche moves in a current of air too faint for you to feel. The shadows on the inscribed walls shift and settle. The text seem in the lamplight and in your state of prepared receptivity to be on the edge of movement, not actually moving. You are not experiencing anything you would describe as a vision or a hallucination, but present in a way that text in ordinary circumstances is not, available in a way that feels less like reading and more like being read. You close your eyes. The darkness behind your eyelids is not significantly different from the darkness of the sanctuary with your eyes open. This is unusual. In most environments, closing your eyes produces a change, a deepening, a shift in the quality of your inner experience. Here, the darkness is already so complete that closing your eyes simply confirms what the sanctuary has been telling you since you entered. That sight is not the relevant sense here. That is what is being asked of you is a different kind of attention. You breathe. The incense from your preparation has dried on your skin and now you are breathing it back. The kipri rising from your own warmth and entering your lungs with each slow inhalation. The smell is deeply familiar by now, so familiar that it has ceased to be something you notice and has become simply the quality of the air you breathe, the atmosphere of your own altered state. The scent that has come to mean through months and years of association, this openness, readiness, the particular quality of consciousness that the temple requires. Somewhere in the body of the temple, a priest is chanting the midnight hymn. The sound travels through stone with a quality that no amount of physical explanation quite accounts for. You feel it in your chest before you hear it in your ears, a low vibration in the stone beneath you that enters your body through the contact points of your back and your heels, a sound that is simultaneously external and internal, both arriving from outside and resonating within. The chant is the oldest form of the sacred language. The hieratic register is not used in ordinary communication, that exists only for ritual purposes, that carries within its sounds a history of usage so deep and so continuous that the words themselves have become saturated with intention, the way the temple's walls are saturated with incense smoke. This language has been spoken in this context for centuries before you were born. It will be spoken for centuries after you are gone. In speaking it and hearing it, you are participating in something that dwarfs any individual life and any individual moment. You let it carry you. Your body grows heavy against the mat. The coolness of the stone beneath you is no longer something you are managing or resisting. It, it becomes simply the condition of the floor, which is simply the condition of the earth, which is simply the condition of existing in a physical world that is older and heavier and more patient than anything human. You are still breathing, you are still present, but the boundary between presence and absence, between waking and sleeping, between what you are and what you are becoming in this moment, is dissolving the way the colors of the sunset dissolved earlier in this evening. Not suddenly, not with any clear demarcation, but gradually and completely, until the question of where one state ended and another began no longer seems like a question worth asking. Before sleep takes you completely, let us stay for a while with the Egyptian theory of dreams, because it is one of the most sophisticated and pre-modern theories of the unconscious mind that human civilization has produced. And understanding it changes the quality of what you are about to experience. The Egyptians identified several different categories of dream, and their categorization maps in remarkable ways onto the distinctions that modern sleep researchers and deep psychologists have independently arrived at. The first category was what they call simple or direct dreams. These were understood as straightforward communications, usually from a deity or from a soul of a deceased ancestor, conveying information in relatively unambiguous symbolic language. A god appearing in a dream and speaking clearly, a deceased parent indicating the location of a lost object, a warning about a journey expressed through the image of a broken road. These dreams were considered gifts, blessings of clarity from intelligences that existed at a level of the cosmos where the information was simply available in a way it was not available to the waking mind, which was limited by the constraints of embodied time bound perception. The second category was what might be translated as oracular or message dreams. These were more complex, using symbol and metaphor in a way that required interpretation. The imagery was drawn from the mythological vocabulary of Egyptian religion, specific animals carrying specific meanings, specific plants, specific actions whose significance was encoded in a symbolic system that the dream interpreters of the temple, the priests who specialize in this art, has studied for years. A serpent in an Egyptian dream was not simply a snake. It was depending on its color, its size, its behavior, its direction of movement, its association with other elements in the dream, potentially any of a dozen different things. The protective Uraeus of the pharaoh, the chaos serpent Apep who threatened the solar bark, a symbol of renewal associated with the shedding of skin, the double serpents of the jet pillar associated with Osiris with resurrection, or simply the animal itself observed by the dreaming mind and requiring no symbolic interpretation at all. Reading these dreams was a genuine intellectual discipline. The papyri that has survived from temple archives, particularly the dream book preserved in the Chester Beatty Papyrus, which dates to around 1275 BCE, but also certainly records a much older tradition, contain detailed interpretive guides covering hundreds of dream images with their positive and negative valences and their contextual variations. The existence of these texts tells us something important about how seriously the Egyptians took the project of understanding the dreaming mind. They were empiricists about it in the most straightforward sense. They observed, they recorded, they compared observations across dreamers and across time. They developed a systematic interpretive framework based on accumulated data, and they revised the framework when new data contradicted it. This is recognizably a scientific approach to the problem of understanding the unconscious mind. It predates Freud's first systematic work on dream interpretation by 3,000 years. The third and most important category of dream in the context of temple incubation that you are now experiencing was what might be translated as the divine encounters dream. This was understood as an experience categorically different from ordinary dreaming, not a communication from the divine, but a direct experience of the divine, not a message delivered through symbolic imagery, but an unmediated meeting with a presence that existed at a level of reality that the ordinary waking mind could not access. The Egyptians had a concept for the soul that was actually a composite of several distinct entities, each with different properties and different fates. The Ba was the personality, the unique individual character that made a person who they were. The Ka was the vital force, the animating energy, the life in its most essential form. The Akh was the transfigured spirit, the soul that had successfully completed the journey of death and transformation and emerged as a luminous being capable of moving between worlds. During sleep, the Ba was understood to leave the body and travel. This was not considered alarming or dangerous in ordinary sleep. The Ba always returned to its body at waking, but it was understood as a genuine journey, a real movement through spaces that existed adjacent to but distinct from ordinary world of waking experience. In the sacred space of the temple, the journey was directed. The preparations The prayers, the incense, the acoustic environment, the painted stars on the ceiling, the proximity of the god statue in the naos, all of this was understood as providing the Ba with a navigation system, a map, a set of intentions that directed the wandering soul toward a specific encounter that the incubation was designed to produce. Whether this is best understood as theology or psychology, as something literally happening to non material aspect of the person, or as something occurring entirely within the architecture of the human brain, it is a question that remains genuinely open. What is not open to question is that the practice produced results that were meaningful to the people who experienced them, that those results were often specific and actionable rather than vague and atmospheric, and the tradition was maintained with extraordinary consistency for an extraordinary length of time. Things that do not work tend to not to persist for 2,500 years. The academic study of Egyptian dream incubation is a field that contains, like most genuinely interesting scholarly debates, more uncertainty than certainty, that and more productive disagreement than settled conclusion. What is agreed upon is this: the practice existed, it was widespread, it was taken seriously by the religious and intellectual establishment of the ancient Egypt, and it left behind a documentary record of sufficient to establish its broad outlines, even if many of its specifics remain obscure. What is debated is almost everything else. Some scholars argue that the Egyptian practice was essentially continuous with the Greek incubation tradition that later adopted many of its features, that there is a direct transmission of both practice and theory from the Nile River valley to the shrines of Asclepius and beyond, and that understanding Egyptian dream incubation is therefore essential for understanding the roots of a tradition that influenced medicine, psychology, and religious practice throughout the Western world. The scholars are more cautious, pointing out that the parallels between Egyptian and Greek incubation may reflect independent convergence on similar practices rather than direct transmission, and the direct differences between the two traditions are as significant as the similarities. The Greek incubation tradition was more explicitly therapeutic. People came to the shrines of Asclepius specifically for healing, and the dreams they produced were understood primarily as medical diagnoses and prescriptions. The Egyptian tradition was broader, encompassing healing but also divination, personal guidance, and the specifically priestly practice of maintaining communication with the divine as part of the ongoing work of cosmic maintenance. There is also a debate about the relationship between the incubatory practices of the priests themselves and the more accessible version of dream consultation that was available to ordinary Egyptians. The great temples were not the only places where healing and guidance were sought through dreams. Local shrines, the tombs of particularly venerated ancestors, and the chapels of household deities all served as sites for less formal but equally earnest incubatory practices at a popular level. The dream interpreters, honored critics from the Greek word for dream, who set up shop near temples and in marketplaces, offering their services to anyone who had experienced a significant dream and wanted professional help understanding it, presents represent a fascinating interface between the high priestly tradition and popular religious practice. Their dream books, versions of which have survived in several papyri, show a tradition that was simultaneously deeply learned and thoroughly practical, capable of addressing both the grand symbolic vocabulary of the mythological tradition and the immediate practical concerns of ordinary people worried about their crops, their children, and their relationships. One particularly intriguing set of documents are what scholars call the demotic dream papyri, texts written in the later, more cursive form of the Egyptian script, dating from the period when Egyptian culture was in contact with Hellenistic and later Roman influences. These texts show a tradition actively engaged with new ideas and new cultural contexts, adapting its interpretive frameworks to incorporate elements from Greek and later Mesopotamian dream theory while maintaining its fundamentally Egyptian character. They suggest that the Egyptian dream interpretation tradition was not a static system frozen in its most ancient form, but a living intellectual practice capable of growth and self revision, which in turn suggests that the priests who maintained it were not merely custodians of inherited knowledge, but active thinkers, genuinely curious about the phenomena that they were working with and genuinely committed to understanding them better. Perhaps the most debated question of all is the role of consciousness altering substances in the incubatory practice. The blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, appears with extraordinary frequency in Egyptian religious art, woven into garlands, held in the hands of gods and worshippers, floating in ceremonial pools. It is not merely decorative. Chemical analysis has confirmed that the blue lotus contains compounds including apomorphine and luciferin that have mild psychoactive properties, producing a state of relaxed alertness and mild euphoria that is described by modern people who have consumed it as conducive to vivid, directed dreaming. Other plants in the Kipi formulation similarly deserve scrutiny from this perspective. Mandrake, which appears in some temple inventories, contains compounds that in sufficient doses produce genuine dreamlike states in the waking mind. Certain preparations of honey used in ritual contexts may have contained fermentation products that have contributed to the altered states sought in incubation. Whether the Egyptians were aware that specific plants produced specific mental effects and incorporated the knowledge deliberately into their incubatory practice, or whether the inclusion of these substances was understood entirely in the ritual and theological terms that the texts describe, it is a question that the available evidence does not definitively answer. Most contemporary scholars who have engaged with this question adopt a both and position. The plants were understood within a ritual framework that described their effects in theological rather than pharmacological terms. But the Egyptians were careful and sophisticated observers of the natural world, and it would be extraordinarily if they had failed to notice the relationship between specific substances and specific mental states across millennia of daily use. What all of this scholarly debate circles around without quite saying directly is something like this. The ancient Egyptians developed, through a combination of theological insight, empirical observation, and practical experimentation, a system for accessing the deeper contents of human consciousness that was extraordinarily sophisticated for its time. that produced results meaningful enough to sustain the practice for thousands of years, and that anticipates many of the discoveries of modern deaf psychology in ways that are genuinely striking and genuinely unexplained. The temple in this reading is not simply a building, it is a technology of consciousness. And the sleeping priest on his reed mat in the sanctuary is not simply a man asleep in a dark room. He is a practitioner at the cutting edge of the most advanced inner science of his civilization. Step back now from the inner sanctuary and consider the world outside the temple walls. On the other side of the enclosure wall, Egypt sleeps in its own way. The farmers and the fishermen and the potters and the weavers and the soldiers and the scribes and the merchants and their families, all of them navigating the same darkness, the same stars, the same Nile night, without the benefit of the temple's architecture or the temple's technology or the centuries of accumulated priestly knowledge. And yet, they are not, in any simple sense, without their own relationship to the daydreaming mind. The ordinary Egyptian village home was small, typically a single room or a few connected rooms of mud brick, with a flat roof that served as an additional living space during the cooler months. The furniture was minimal, low wooden platforms for sleeping, sometimes with a headrest of carved wood or alabaster that preserved the elaborate hairstyles of the period, but which looked to modern eyes more like instruments of discomfort than rest. The headrest is worth pausing on. The Egyptian word for headrest was weres, which was also associated with the concept of watching, specifically the watching that happens during sleep, the vigilance of the Ba as it traveled, the receptivity of the dreaming mind. The headrest was not simply a practical object for keeping the hair neat, it was understood as a threshold object, something positioned at the boundary between the waking and the sleeping self, a guardian of the passage. Images of Bess were carved on the ends of headrests, watching the sleepers from either side. Protective spells were sometimes written on the underside where the neck would rest, invisible to ordinary vision, but present in the wood, saturating the object with intention, the way that the temple walls were saturated with inscription. The ordinary Egyptian went to sleep with a different preparation than the temple priest, but it was still a preparation. The household had its own ritual cycle. Prayers to the household gods, the small terracotta or wooden figures that stood in niches in the wall and received daily offerings of flowers and oil and food. The lighting of a lamp that would burn through the night. The darkness was not trusted, not because the Egyptians were afraid of the dark in any simple sense, but because the night hours were genuinely understood as a time when the boundaries between the ordinary world and less ordinary forces were thinner, when protections were necessary. The ordinary Egyptian also slept, when possible, with their head pointing east. This practice is documented in several household manuals and is consistent with the solar theology that structured Egyptian religious life at every level. The east was the direction of the rising sun, the direction from which life and light and renewed energy emerged each morning. To sleep with your head pointing east was to align your body with the direction of renewal, to orient the dreaming mind toward the source from which the new day would come. It was also, though the Egyptians would not have used this language, a way of managing the psychological experience of sleep. For a culture in which the death and resurrection of myth of Osiris provided the fundamental template for understanding what happened to consciousness during the night hours, to orient yourself toward the east before sleep was to remind your sleeping mind of the direction of return. You might be entering darkness, but you were pointed toward the dawn. The present woman, with her headdress and her household lamp and her head pointing east, had access to none of the elaborate architecture of the temple's consciousness technology. She had no hypostyle hall, no sacred lake, no kaipi, no star painted ceiling, no acoustic chamber designed to do specific things to the nervous system. What she had was the same darkness, the same stars, the same null night, and the relationship to the mythology that structured her world that was, if anything, more intimate than a priest's relationship because it was not mediated by the learning and institution and hierarchy, but was simply the water she swam in, the story she had breathed since childhood, the fundamental grammar of how existence worked. When she dreamed in the same symbols that the temple priests interpreted, the same serpents and scarabs and scales and boats, the same ancestral figures who came with messages, the same encounters at the boundary within between worlds. And when those dreams were significant, when they arrived with the unmistakable quality of weight and vividness and emotional clarity that distinguishes a meaningful dream from ordinary nocturnal mental noise, she knew what to do with them. She knew which of her neighbors were skilled in their interpretation. She knew which local shrine to visit if she needed to sleep deliberately in order to receive guidance. She knew the prayers that prepared the mind for reception and the prayers that expressed gratitude for what was received. The knowledge was distributed, not democratically. The priests knew more in a technical sense and had access to tools and spaces that ordinary people did not. But the fundamental understanding, the bedrock recognition that the sleeping mind was a domain of genuine significance that deserved attention and respect and careful cultivation, was common to every level of Egyptian society. This is one of the things that distinguishes ancient Egypt from most modern societies. We have perhaps never been more sophisticated in our physiological understanding of the brain does during sleep. The neuroscience of sleep is one of the most active and productive research areas in contemporary biology, and what it has discovered is genuinely extraordinary. But we have largely lost the cultural framework that tells us what ac- that activity means. The neurological events of REM sleep are documented with astonishing precision. The emotional and cognitive significance of what happens during those events is left and almost entirely to the individual to figure out alone. The ancient Egyptian solution was not perfect. Like all human systems, it contained its share of superstition and cultural distortion, and the inevitable tendency of institutions to serve themselves alongside serving their stated purpose. The dream interpreters who set up near the temples were not all equally skilled or equally honest. The priestly hierarchy was not immune to politics and self interest, but it was a solution, a genuine attempt to build a cultural relationship with the dreaming mind that was available to everyone, that provided tools for attention and interpretation, that communicated through its myths and its architecture and its daily ritual cycle a single fundamental message. This matters. Pay attention. The sleeping mind has something to tell you that the waking mind cannot generate on its own. The temple has 12 hours of night, just as it has 12 hours of day. This is not metaphor. The Egyptians divided both day and night into 12 equal parts, their length varying with the seasons but their number remaining constant. A division that gave us, through the long chain of calendar transmission, our own 24-hour day. The priests tracked these hours meticulously. The position of specific stars indicated the hour, and the hours were not merely units of time, but were understood as individual beings with names and properties and specific tasks in the maintenance of the cosmos. The hour goddesses, the 12 of them, moved through the night in procession, each one responsible for guiding the solar bark of Ra through one chamber of the underworld. The texts that describe this journey, what scholars call the Amduat, the book of what is in the underworld, were inscribed in extraordinary detail on the walls of the royal tombs and in their most accessible versions in temple sanctuaries and on papyri. They described each hour of the night as this distinct environment, a chamber in a vast subterranean palace that which the sun god traveled in his bark, accompanied by his divine crew, encountering the residents of the underworld, renewing the energy of the dead, overcoming the challenges and obstacles placed by the forces of chaos, and emerging transformed at the 12th hour into the eastern horizon where the dawn waited. The priest sleeping in the sanctuary was not simply going through the night, he was participating in this journey. His sleeping mind was understood as a microcosm of the solar bark, navigating the same chambers, encountering the same figures, the same challenges, with the same destination. The renewal that was waiting on the other side of the darkness. The first hour of the night was the hour of entry, of descent. In the mythology, it was characterized by the moment when the solar bark passed through the gates of the western horizon and the world above was sealed off. The deadline of the corridors of the first chamber greeted the arriving sun with cries of recognition and welcome. The air here was cool and still, the darkness comprehensive but not oppressive, the sense of transition and clear and purposeful. In sleep, the first hour corresponded to the deepening that you have already experienced, the passage from the outer world through the progressive enclosures of the temple into the sanctuary, the moment of lying down, the gradual recession of the waiting world. The middle hours of the night, the fifth, sixth, and seventh hours, were described in the Amduat as the most perilous and the most significant. This was the deepest point of the journey, the furthest from both the evening and the morning, the zone of maximum darkness and maximum encounter with the difficult contents of the underworld. The chaos serpent Apep made his strongest assault here, attempting to halt the solar bark and prevent the dawn from occurring. The crew of the bark fought him off. The journey continued. In sleep, these hours correspond to what modern sleep science calls the slow wave sleep, the deepest stage of non REM sleep, the stage most important for physical restoration and for the consolidation of memory, the stage which the glymphatic system of the brain performs its extraordinary nightly cleansing, washing away the metabolic waste or products of the day of neural activity. The brain, in slow wave sleep, is doing what something of fundamental importance. The Egyptians, without any of the neurological vocabulary to describe what was happening, understood that the deepest hours of the night were the most significant ones. The later hours, the ninth, 10th, and 11th, were the hours of approach. The sun god's energy was being renewed. The dead in these chambers were animated, brought temporarily back to a kind of provisional life by the light of the passing bark. The atmosphere shifted from the peril of the middle hours to something more like anticipation and expectancy, the quality of air just before dawn when the sky is still dark, but something in the quality of the darkness has changed, has become permeable, has become begun to let the light through. These were the hours most associated with significant dreaming, the REM sleep that tends to be richest and most vivid in the later hours of the night, when the cycles of sleep have moved through the deeper stages and the mind is rising against toward waking consciousness. The dreams of the ninth and tenth hours were understood by the priests as the most likely to carry the specific quality of direct divine communication through incubation sought. And the 12th hour was the hour of convergence. The solar bark passed through the final gate. The body of the rejuvenated sun god was lifted out of his sleep sarcophagus by the arms of the sky goddess, the beetle-headed figure of Capri, the morning form of the sun, the god of becoming, of the thing that is always in the process of arriving, rose from the bark and entered the body of the sky. And the priest on his reed mat in the sanctuary opens his eyes. The lamp in the wall niche has burned down to a small steady flame. The darkness of the sanctuary was the same darkness it has been when he lay down. Nothing visible has changed. Everything invisible had. Let the pace slow now. Let the words come less often and stay longer in the silence between them. You are in the sanctuary. Your mat on the floor, the cool stone beneath, the star painted ceiling above you, the invisible in the dark, the lamp's small fire somewhere to your left, not visible from where you were lying, only its effect perceptible, a very slight warming of the absolute dark towards something that is still almost dark but not quite. Your body has been still for hours. This is something that modern people rarely experience. Genuine, extended physical stillness. We shift and turn and adjust in our sleep, changing position multiple times through the night in response to pressure and temperature and the normal demands of a body maintaining its circulation. But the training you have received includes practices that reduce this movement, that teaches the body to find over months and years a stillness that is not rigidity of tension, but the settledness of something genuinely at rest. The priests understood through observation rather than through the neuroscientific vocabulary that would eventually describe the mechanism, that physical stillness in sleep was correlated with a particular quality of dreaming, that the body that had genuinely released its daytime activity, that had been purified and prepared and laid down with intention, produced dreams of different quality than the body had that was tired and unwashed and collapsed into unconsciousness as a last resort after the day's demands had finally outrun its energy. You are still. Something is present in the darkness of the sanctuary, not something frightening, something old. The way that the smell of stone in ancient places is not frightening, but is old in a way that bypasses the ordinary categories of pleasant and unpleasant, arrives at something more fundamental, the recognition of age, of time accumulated, of what it feels like to be in the presence of duration so great that your own life becomes, in relation to it, something almost imperceptibly brief. The walls of this sanctuary have been inscribed for over 1,000 years before you were born. The words on these walls have been spoken in this room daily for longer than any living memory can reach. The god whose presence is concentrated at the nows at the end of the room has been receiving offerings in this specific place since before your great 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 grandmother was born. Since before the oldest story anyone in your world can tell. What does it mean to sleep in a place like that? Jung, writing in the 20th century, described the concept he called the collective unconscious, the layer of human psyche that lies beneath the personal unconscious, beneath the accumulated memories and experiences and emotional residues of an individual life, and that contain the inherited structures of human experience itself, the archetypes, the fundamental patterns of encounter and transformation that are not learned but are built into the architecture of the human mind as surely as language capacity or the ability to recognize a face. He arrived at this concept through decades of careful observation of dreams, his own and his patients'. He noticed that certain images and narratives appeared in dreams with a consistency that could not be explained by personal history, that the imagery of mythology surfaced in the dreams of people who have never studied mythology, that the structure of ancient religious narratives appeared in the dreams of modern secular people who had no conscious access to those traditions. He concluded the unconscious mind contained, at its deepest level, a kind of shared library, a collection of images and patterns and narrative templates that belonged not to the individual but to the species, that were as truly human as opposable thumbs or binocular vision, that express themselves in dreams and in art and in the great recurring stories that every culture, independently or in dialogue, produced from the same deep spring. He called the figures that populated this shared library archetypes: the great mother, the wise old man, the shadow, the self, the trickster, the hero, the threshold guardian, and what the ancient Egyptians knew with a practical certainty that preceded Jung's theoretical framework by 3,000 years was that this layer of the mind, the layer that was not individual but collective, not personal but human, was most accessible during sleep, was, in fact, the primary source of the communication that incubatory practices sought to receive. To sleep inside the temple was to place yourself at the interface between your personal mind and the oldest layer of the human mind, to make yourself available to images and narratives and encounters that were not generated by your individual history, but by the vast accumulated history of your species, modified and shaped by the specific mythological vocabulary of your culture, but drawing on something that underlay all cultures, that was present before any specific cultural form arose to give it expression. The sanctuary, with its star painted ceiling and its inscribed walls and its sealed naos holding the localized presence of the divine, was a device for assessing that layer. The preparations and purifications was the method of approach. The dreaming priest on his reed mat was the instrument, and what came in the dark was whatever the collective unconscious chose to send when the individual had become sufficiently quiet to receive it. Something moves at the edge of perception, not a sound, not quite a sight, not in the ordinary sense. Something closer to a quality of presence, a shift in the texture of the darkness, a sense that the space around you has changed its relationship to itself in a way that has no simple physical explanation. The Egyptians had a word for this, Nedjer, usually translated as God, but translation is inadequate in the way that single word translations of complex concepts always are. Nedjer was a quality as much as an entity, the quality of that which is numinous, the word that the German theologian Rudolf Otto would eventually use to describe the irreducible quality of religious experience, the sense of being in the presence of something that is simultaneously utterly other and utterly familiar, overwhelmingly powerful and deeply intimate, impossible to look at directly and impossible not to look at. The priest does not see anything, he perceives something. This distinction matters enormously in the context of the Egyptian understanding of sacred experience. The divine was not typically encountered through visual hallucination. It was not something that appeared against the backdrop of ordinary consciousness like a spotlight or an apparition. It was something that entered the structure of consciousness itself, that altered the quality of experience from within rather than presenting itself as an external object. In the sanctuary, in the deepest hours of the night, in the state produced by days of preparation and specific sensory environment of the temple, the priest experiences what the texts describe as the flooding of the heart, a warmth and expansion that is nothing like emotion in the ordinary sense, not happiness, not peace, not any of the named states, but something prior to named states, something that those named states are particular expressions of, the way specific colors are particular expressions of light. Later, when he tries to write about this in the formal language of the sacred texts, the priest will use the language of the tradition. He will speak of the God's presence, of divine communication, of a message received and a question answered. But in the moment itself, the experience is beyond the reach of the tradition's language, as all genuine experiences at this level are. The tradition provides the container, the preparation, the vocabulary of approach and interpretation. What fills the container in the moment of filling exceeds the container's capacity to describe. It is enough. It is more than enough. The lamp burns its small fires in the niche. The stone cools and holds its cool patient beneath the mat. The stars on the ceiling wait in their painted positions for the moment when they become unnecessary, when the real dawn arrives and their representation is superseded by what they represent. The priest sleeps. The priest dreams. The priest is dreamed. Let us listen for a while. The temple at night is not silent. It only seems silent by comparison with the day, with the sounds of the city and the river and the human activity that surrounds the enclosure wall from morning until evening. By absolute standards, the temple at night is full of sound, quiet sounds, careful sounds, sounds that have been part of this environment for as long as they have been structural, as much as part of the space as the stone itself. The first sound is the river. The Nile is always present. From anywhere within the temple precinct, at any hour, if you stop and listen past the immediate sounds of the building, the distant footstep, the guttering lamp, the creak of the wood of a wooden door in its stone socket, you can hear the river, a low, continuous movement, not dramatic, not punctuated, but always there, a sound that the Egyptians had heard from birth and that became so foundational to the experience of being alive in Egypt that its absence in places far from the river was one of the things that most commonly cited by Egyptians who traveled as something they missed. The river sounds different at different hours of the night. In the early hours, it carries the residue of the day, the distant sounds of boats still on the water, the call of a night fisherman, the splash of a crocodile entering the shallows. In the middle hours, it settled into something more uniform and more ancient, the sound of a large body of water moving in its deep channel with the indifference of something that has been doing exactly this for millions of years and will continue doing it long after every temple on its back has been reduced to sand. In the hours before dawn, the river seems to quicken slightly. The sound of it changes in a way that is difficult to describe precisely, but unmistakable to anyone who has listened to it carefully as the priests learn to listen to everything in their environment. Something in its movement becomes more purposeful, more energized, as though the river itself is responding to the approaching dawn with something like anticipation. The priests call this the breathing of none, the primordial ocean. The Nile was understood as the surface expression of the vast underground water that underlay all of Egypt, all of the world, the original ocean from which creation had emerged in the first moment of existence. To hear the river at night was to hear the respiration of the world before the world had yet been fully made. The second sound is the wind. The desert wind in Egypt is not constant, but it is frequent, and at night it often arises in the hours between midnight and dawn. A dry, warm wind with the south that carries the smell of sand and distance and something unnameable that is not quite any specific smell, but is the smell of a landscape so large and so elemental that it has become the smell of space itself. The wind moves through the temple in complex ways. The thick walls deflect most of it, but the gateways and the courtyard and the clerestory screens of the hypostyle hall create passages through which it flows, producing tones, low and harmonic, too complex to be called a note, but structured enough to be called music, if music is understood in its most fundamental sense as the organization sound by a non human intelligence. The wind through the clerestory screens of the hypostyle hall was considered by the priests to be the voice of Shu, the god of air and space, the invisible medium that held the sky above the earth, whose presence was everywhere and whose body was made of nothing solid, only the space between things. In the sanctuary, the wind is almost inaudible, but almost inaudible is not inaudible. There's a quality to the air in the most innermost room that reflects the movement of air outside, not as a sound, but as a very faint pressure variation, a rhythm of slightly more or slightly less density at the atmosphere that your body registers as at the level of sensation rather than hearing. Breathe with it. The third sound is the fire, the sacred flame in its brazier, the lamps in their niches, the coals in the outer courts. Fire has a voice that changes with its mood. In the early evening, when the fires are freshly fed and burning vigorously, they produce a crackling energy, an assertive presence that fills the space around them with a quality of aliveness that is genuinely warm in the most both literal and figurative sense. As the night deepens and the fires burn lower, the sound becomes quieter and more intimate. The crackle softens to a hiss. The hiss softens to a whisper. The whisper, in the smallest hours of the night, becomes something closer to breathing, a gentle, irregular sound that the sleeping mind incorporates without difficulty into whatever it is doing, adding a note of ongoing life to the quiet of the sacred space. Fire, for the Egyptians, was a complex symbol. It was the fire of Ra, the sun's energy made manifest at human scale. It was the fire that destroyed, that burned the enemies of Ma'at, that purified what needed purifying. It was the fire of creative intelligence, the inner fire of the mind that distinguished the living from the dead. To sleep near the fire in the temple was to sleep to the presence of the sun, even in the sun's absence. The priests who maintained the sacred flame through the night was not merely firekeepers in the practical sense. They were maintaining the presence of Ra in the underworld, a small material echo of the great solar bark's passages through the dark hours. The fourth sound is stone. Stone is not silent. Old stone, especially, is not silent. stone that has been exposed to variations in temperature over thousands of years, the heat of the Egyptian day and the cold of the Egyptian night, the flood seasons and the dry seasons, the weight of its own mass, settling and redistributing over centuries, produces sounds, very quiet sounds, heard only in the hours when everything else is quiet. A crack, not sharp, but low and distant, like the sound of something that has been patient for a long time, finally making a small private adjustment. A whisper that is not wind, a tone at the edge of hearing that may have been stone itself, or maybe the resonance of some frequency produced by the geometry of the space and the density of the air and the accumulated thermal memory of the walls. The priest heard these sounds and understood them as the speech of Geb, the earth god, whose body was the ground beneath everything, whose voice was the voice of the stone world, slow and deep and barely audible to human ears, but constant and reliable and always present. Listen now to whatever surrounds you, the sounds of wherever you are, a house, an apartment, a room in whatever city or landscape your life has placed you in, the sounds of traffic or wind, or the settling of the building around you, or the breathing of someone nearby, or the absolute quiet that sometimes arrives at certain hours of the night when the world has genuinely stilled. Whatever you hear, it is the current version of the same thing the priest heard in the sanctuary, the world breathing, declaring its own presence through the medium of sound, saying, in the language that everything uses when it speaks to the human ear at the edge of sleep, I am here, I continue, you are held. There's something we have not yet said directly, though it has been present in everything we have said. The temple is built in the shape of a human being, not literally, not in the obvious way, external way. You would not look at the floor plan of a great Egyptian temple and see a human form, but in its deep structural logic, in the way it is organized, in the sequence of spaces it creates, the progressive movement from the public and the multiple toward the private and the singular. The temple enacts the same journey as the journey from the social exterior of a person to the irreducible interior of the same person. The outer court is the public self, the face presented to the world, the person as seen from the outside, the social identity that is real and genuine but is not the whole story. The hypostyle hall is the mind, dense, complex, full of structure and meaning, a forest of thought and symbol and association, beautiful and overwhelming in its richness, productive of that specific quality of slightly vertiginous awareness that comes from genuine intellectual encounter. The inner chambers are the deep interior, the rooms that most people, even people who know you well, never enter. The places where your actual experience of being alive, stripped of social meditation and intellectual framing, simply exists quietly, without performance, without agenda. And the sanctuary, the naos, the innermost point where the God is held in the dark. That is what, in human terms, has no proper name. Not that soul through the word gestures in the right direction. Not the self that is closer, something prior to the words for it. Something that is simply what remains when every layer of acquisition and performance and social identity and intellectual construction has been temporarily set aside. The ancient Egyptians called it the ib, the heart, not the physical heart, though the physical heart was understood as its residence. which is why the heart was the only organ that was not removed during mummification. Everything else could be separated from the body, but the heart, the ib, had to remain because the ib was not the essential person, the irreducible minimum, the thing that could not be extracted away without the result of no longer being you. To sleep in the sanctuary was to sleep in the part of the temple that corresponded to the ib, to place the most unguarded version of yourself, the self of sleep, the self that cannot maintain its social and intellectual constructions because consciousness is not available to maintain them in the architectural equivalent to the heart. This is why the preparation method. You could not walk in from the street and lie down in the sanctuary and expect the experience that incubation offered. The transition from the outer world to the inner sanctuary had to be earned through a genuine corresponding transition in your own interior. The temple could not do it for you. It would facilitate, support, and amplify, but the journey inward was yours to make. And here's what the priests knew through long practice about the journey inward. It was not frightening. This was perhaps the thing that surprised people most when they first made it. The anticipation of looking directly at your own deepest interior, at the contents of what Egyptians understood as the halls of your own heart, was often more frightening than the actual experience. Because what was there at the bottom was not the monsters that anxiety tends to project onto the unknown. What was there, what the priest lying in the sanctuary experienced in the deepest hours of the incubatory night, was something closer to the quality of the river at its deepest point, not turbulent, not dramatic, continuous, patient, older than the individual life it moved through, moving in a direction that the individual life did not choose but that felt, when encountered directly, like the correct direction, the direction that had been chosen for you at the some level of the self below the level where personal choosing happens. The Egyptians called this Sia, divine wisdom, the intelligence that was not individual but was available to the individual who had made themselves genuinely receptive to it. You did not generate Sia, you received it. And the condition of receiving it was the condition of the sanctuary at midnight, a darkness, stillness, emptiness, and the patient, open quality of a mind that had stopped listening and insisting on its own agenda long enough to hear what the darkness had to say. The 12th hour arrives. It arrives not as a sound but as a quality. Something in the darkness of the sanctuary changes, not lightens. It is still dark, but will remain dark for a while yet, sealed as it is from the eastern sky by layer of stone. But the quality of the darkness changes, a faint pressure differential, the stone walls responding at the level of thermal sensitivity too subtle for ordinary waking awareness, but accessible to a mind that has been still and receptive for hours to the approach of the sun. The priest wakes, not with alarm, but with the sudden return of the socially constructed self, the rush of identity and agenda, and the day's demands that characterizes most modern waking. He surfaces slowly, the way the solar bark surfaces the underworld at the 12th hour, gradually, with a sense of something being completed, of a journey accomplished, of the self returning from somewhere genuinely far away. He lies still for a while. He does not immediately sit up or reach for the lamp or begin the mental process of sorting and categorizing and interpreting what the night has produced. He has been taught to wait, to allow the contents of the night to settle like silt settling in still water, becoming visible as this disturbance passes and the transparency returns. The dreams, if dreams came, are present in him not as memories, not yet, but as a quality of knowing, a changed interior atmosphere, a sense of having been given something that is now his, but that he has not yet fully inventoried. Later, when the time is right, he will write them down. He will speak of them to the senior priest who serves as his teacher and interpreter. He will hold them against the language of tradition and see what aspects of their meaning that tradition can illuminate. But now, in the first moments of return, he simply rests with the quality of what came. The Egyptians had a praise for the state of having received genuine divine communication through a dream. They said the heart was enlarged. The word they used for the enlargement was a word also associated with the flooding of the Nile. The annual inundation that was not a disaster, it would seem to people unfamiliar with it, but a blessing, the renewal of the earth, the deposition of the nutrient rich silt that Egyptian agriculture, the most productive in the ancient world, the flooded heart, the heart that has been enlarged by inundation of meaning that it could not have produced on its own, that arrived from somewhere larger than the individual self, that has deposited something in the interior landscape that will remain, will enrich, will produce growth long after the waters recede. That is the purpose of the night. Not rest, though rest came, not the absence of the day, though the day's absence was necessary, but this, the expansion of the interior, the enlargement of what the self was capable of holding, the deposit of something received from the dark, that the light could now begin the long work of understanding. The priest rises from his mat. He rolls it carefully and sets it against the wall. He trims the lamp, which is burning very low now, close to the end of its oil. He speaks the dawn prayer, the words of greeting to the returning sun, the declaration that the night has been traveled and the morning is recognized and welcomed. He walks out of the sanctuary, through the vestibule, through the halls of offerings, into the hypostyle hall where the first light of dawn is beginning to enter through the clerestory screens. The columns emerge from the night dark, one by one, as the light increases. Their carvings suddenly present again in the way the moonlight has only hinted at. The colors of the painted reliefs, the deep red, the lapis blue, the gold, the green of new growth, came back into the world. He stands in the middle of the hypostyle hall and lets the lights arrive. It takes a few minutes. The sun rises fast in Egypt with a decisiveness that northern countries never quite experience, a sudden arrival of full light rather than the long drawn out grey transition of higher latitudes. One moment the hall is dim, and the next it is alive with a quality of light that is specifically Egyptian, a light with weight and warmth in it, a light that feels less like illumination and more like presence. The priest stands in this light and breathes. He is the same person who lay down in the sanctuary last night, and he is not. Something has shifted, something has been added, something that was already in him has been discovered and brought to the surface. The way the night's geological processes bring minerals to the surface and the daylight then makes visible. He cannot yet say what it is. He may not be able to say for days or weeks or until a situation arrives in his life that the night's gift was specifically preparing him for. The meaning of what comes in dreams is not always immediately available. Sometimes it is slow release, unfolding over time, becoming clear only in retrospect when the event it was preparing for has occurred. But he knows something came, and knowing something came is itself significant because it confirms what the tradition has always told him and what his own practice has been moving him toward, that the night is not nothing, that the sleeping mind is not inactive, that the darkness through which the solar bark travels is not empty, but is full, full of figures and forces and intelligence, and the meaning and the deep, slow movement of something that was there before the first human being ever looked up at the stars and tried to make sense of what they saw. The outer courts are waking. The junior priests who slept on their reed mats by the braziers are rising, their breath making small clouds in the cool morning air. They are shaking out their white robes and beginning the first ritual of the day, the dawn prayers, the greeting of the sun, the reestablishment of Ma'at after the night's passage. There is an energy in the early morning temple that is different from every other hour of the day. It is not the solemnity of the deep night, when the weight of everything that temple represents pressed on the consciousness like water's pressures at depth. It is lighter than that, more open, more provisional. The day had not yet accumulated its demands. The world has been renewed. Whatever was difficult about yesterday exists now in a slightly different proportion to everything else. Smaller, perhaps, or simply more clearly bounded, with the contours of its actual significance more visible than they were still in the midst of it. The sacred lake catches the first light. Its surface goes from black to gray to pale milky gold. And then, as the sun clears the horizon, to something that has no color name adequately captures, not gold, not copper, not white, but some specific combination of all three that had the Egyptians associated with the feather of Ma'at, the feather that was weighted against the heart of the afterlife, the feather that was the measurement of a life well lived. The priest bathe again in this light, the cool water of the lake now carrying the warmth of the first sun, and they say the morning prayers that are the counterpart and the completion of the evening prayers said the night before. The circle of the day completed, the sun returned from its journey, the world once more for another day confirmed as a place worth inhabiting. In this sanctuary, the final preparations of the morning ritual are being made. The senior priest, who will open the naos and attend to the god's morning needs, the unwrapping of the statue, the unwashing, the anointing with the oil, the dressing in fresh linen, the presentation of food and incense, is at work, his proof movements precise and unhurried as they have been from every morning for decades. The nows is opening with the breaking of the clay seal. The sound of the seal is breaking is small, barely a sound at all, a faint crack, a whisper of clay dust falling, and yet is the absolute quiet of the sanctuary at this hour it lands with a significance that is entirely disproportionate to its physical scale. Something closed is opening, something private is becoming. In the controlled and respectful sense of the ritual is available. The morning light, entering through the doorways that lead from the outer rooms, has now reached the hypostyle hall and is beginning, at the angle appropriate to this season, to cast a beam through a specific opening in the clerestory screens that falls, with the precision of deliberate astronomical calculation embedded in the building's orientation, directly down the central axis of the temple toward the sanctuary door. This is not accident. The temples of ancient Egypt were oriented with astronomical precision. The axes aligned to the rising sun at specific festivals, to the position of important stars at specific seasons, to the course of the Nile and the logic of the flood that gave the agricultural calendar its structure. The light that enters the temple at dawn is the physical arrival of the god, not symbolic, not metaphorical. The beam of morning light that travels down the processional axis and enters the sanctuary is the visual event that completes the night's theological narrative. The sun has made its journey through the underworld and has overcome every obstacle and is now arriving in actual light in the innermost room of its home. The priest opens his hands to receive it, and in this gesture, this simple ancient gesture of the open palm turned upward toward the arriving light, is everything that the night has been preparing for. The open hand, the receptive person, the willingness to receive what comes without grabbing, without demanding, without specifying in advance what form the gift must take. This is what the temple teaches. This is what the night teaches. This is what sleep teaches. When sleep is understood not as the loss of consciousness, but as the consent of consciousness to release its grip, to become temporarily something other than the managing, constructing, protecting entity it is during the waking hours, and is in that release to receive something. The priests who came out of the sanctuary in the morning carried something that they had not carried in, not always something they could name, not always something immediately useful, but something, a quality of knowing, and enlarged interiority, a changed relationship to the question that they had entered the darkness to ask. The ordinary Egyptians who came from a distance to sleep at the shrines and receive healing or guidance or simply the knowledge that they were not alone in their difficulty, they too came out different. Not always with the dramatic transformation that the stories that survive tended to record, more often with something quieter and more lasting, the sense that they have been heard, that the difficulty they had carried for so long had been received by something large enough to hold it. This is something, perhaps, the most fundamental thing that the practice offered, not supernatural information, not miraculous cure, but the direct, embodied experience of being received, of having the full weight of one's inner experience, the fears and questions that the grief and unresolved edges of a human life, taken seriously by something that was not going to flinch from it, was not going to become overwhelmed by it, was not going to be respond by minimizing it or rushing to resolve it. The darkness of the sanctuary could hold everything. It had been holding everything that the humans would came to it brought for thousands of years. It was, in this sense, what the word sanctuary actually means at its deepest level, not a hiding place, but a held place, a place that holds. Come away from the temple now, just slightly, far enough to hear what surrounds it. The Nile at night is one of the defining sounds of the ancient world. Every civilization that has ever built itself around a great river has developed a particular relationship with the sound that river at night when the human activity of the day has stilled and the river's own voice becomes audible above the noise of the civilization that depends on it. The Nile is not a loud river. It is not the roaring, turbulent kind of river that commands attention through sheer volume. It is a deep river, a wide river, a river with a current that is steady and purposeful rather than dramatic. Its sound is low and continuous and deeply reassuring. The sound of something that has been doing exactly what it is doing for so long that the question of whether it will continue no longer arises. The Egyptian word for the Nile was Iteru, simply the river, as though there were only one river and it was this one. And in a sense, for the ancient Egyptians, there was only one. The Nile was not merely a physical feature of the landscape, it was this axis of existence, a thing around which everything turned. Its annual flood, the inundation that came each summer with the rains of Central Africa, depositing the black silt on the valley floor that made Egypt the most agriculturally productive land in the ancient world, was the most important event in the Egyptian calendar. The structure of the Egyptian time was organized around it. The year was divided not into the four seasons of a Mediterranean climate, but into the three seasons defined by the river, the flood, the growing, the harvest. Everything else, the festivals, the rituals, the timings of the great astronomical events that the temples were built to observe, fitted into this tripartite rhythm. The sound of the Nile at night carried all this, not literally, not in any way that the ear could parse and the mind could decode, but in the way that any sound that is deeply associated with the fundamental rhythms of a life carried the resonance of those rhythms. The way rain off of a roof at night carries, for some people, the whole complex of what it means to be inside and safe while the weather does its outdoor work. The way the sound of the sea carries, for people who grew up near it, an entire landscape of childhood and distance and return. For the ancient Egyptians, the sound of the Nile at night was the sound of the world's pulse, the sound of the thing that held everything together, the sound of abundance at its most fundamental, not the abundance of material goods or social comfort, but the abundance of existence itself, the inexhaustible generosity of a universe that continued to produce the conditions for life despite every chaos and every difficulty. The priests in their sanctuary could hear the river very faintly, though all that through all that stone, the river's low voice arrived. It was one of the first things that initiates into the inner precincts noticed. That even here, even in the most enclosed and silent space in the temple, the river was audible if you were quiet enough to hear it. And the priests were taught to hear it, were taught to let the sound of the river serve as an anchor during meditation and during the liminal hours of the incubatory night, not an anchor to the ordinary world, which they were in the process of temporarily releasing, but an anchor to the deep, continuous flow of existence and underlay and outlasted any particular configuration of the ordinary world. The river said, everything continues. The river said, the source is not exhausted. The river said, What appears to end in drought returns in flood. What appears to die in winter returns in spring. What goes down into darkness will rise again in the east. And the sleeping priest, in the deepest hours of the night, heard the river and let it say these things into parts of him that needed to hear them most. Above the temple, above the river, above the flat dark of the desert, the Egyptian night sky is doing something that has been doing every clear night since there were eyes to watch it. The stars are turning slowly, so slowly that you could watch for an hour and not be certain the movement was real, the way you cannot watch the hands of a clock and actually see them move, but look away and look back and they have moved. The stars turn around the pole star, that fixed point in the north that the Egyptians call the imperishable one, the star that did not rise but set, but remained constant in its position while all the other stars wheeled around it. The Egyptians watched the stars with an intensity and a precision that has no obvious equal in the ancient world, not because they were merely curious, though curiosity was certainly part of it, but because the stars were functional. They told time, they indicated season, they mapped the afterlife. The ceiling of the sanctuary, painted with the actual stars of the Egyptian sky, was a map, not a decorative one, a functional one. The priest sleeping beneath it was sleeping beneath a navigation chart for the soul, the same chart in miniature form that covered the ceilings of royal tombs to guide the king's spirit on its journey through the afterlife. The specific stars depicted included the constellation that the Egyptians called Meshkayatu, which we know as the Big Dipper, the plow, which was understood as the vehicle that carried the soul of the king to the northern sky, to the region of the imperishable stars that never set. The stars that have never set, they were always visible in the Egyptian sky, that did not undergo the death of setting and the rebirth of rising, were understood as the souls of the perfectly transformed dead, the ark, the luminous spirits who had completed their journey and achieved a permanent state in the divine realm. To sleep beneath the stars, these stars, real or painted, was to sleep in the company of the perfected dead, to be, even in the most modest sleep, in proximity to the endpoint of the journey that Egyptian religious life understood as the purpose of human existence. Not a frightening proximity, a reassuring one. The Egyptians did not regard death with the horror and the finality that many later cultures attributed to it. Death was a transition, a challenging one, certainly. The text of the Book of the Dead describes its difficulties in considerable detail, and the preparation for it was the work of a lifetime, but not a termination, not the end of the self. The end was one form of the self and the beginning of another, with the possibility for those who navigated the transition successfully of a mode of existence more complete and more luminous than anything embodied life could achieve. To sleep under the stars was to practice this transition in miniature. Every night, the small death of sleep. Every morning, the small resurrection of waking. Every dream, a small version of journey through the underworld. Every significant dream, a small encounter with the reality that the journey, navigated well, led somewhere worth going. The stars are still turning above you, above wherever you are right now, at whatever night this is. The stars are turning with the same steady precision that they turned above the Egyptian temples 3,000 years ago. The Milky Way, if you are somewhere dark enough to see it, arcs across the sky in the same orientation. The pole star holds its position. The constellations, in their seasonal positions, are where they are. The sky does not know that the temples are gone. The sky does not know that the practices they house has been interrupted and lost, and partially recovered and debated and misunderstood. The sky is doing what it has always done, what it will continue to do long after the lost human consciousness had stopped looking up at it. There is comfort in that, the specific kind of comfort that comes from scale, from the awareness that the frame within which your life is occurring is enormously larger than the life itself, and that the enormity of the frame is not threatening but, on the contrary, one of the most reliable sources of peace available to the mind that has learned to find it rather than being made anxious of it. The priests found it there. Night after night, year after year, decade after decade, they found it there, and they built their buildings to make it findable for everyone who came after them. Let the words become fewer now. Let the spaces between them become longer. You have been in the temple for a long time tonight. You have moved through its layers, from the outer court with its cold stone and its braziers, through the forest of the Hypostyle hall with its acoustic columns and its moonlit carvings, through the smallest transitional rooms, into the sanctuary itself where the lamp burns its small fire and the stars hold their positions on the ceiling and the river says what it has always said. You have prepared your body and quieted your mind and made yourself available to yourself, to the way the priests made themselves available to whatever the darkness has to offer. That is enough. You do not need to do anything more. You do not need to intend anything or expect anything or direct anything. The preparation was the work. What comes now in its own time and in its own form does not require your management. Let your body be heavy. Let your breath be slow. The lamp is burning. The stone is cool beneath you. Somewhere the river is moving in its deepest channel, saying the same thing it had said, that the priest who slept there, the same thing it is said to the farmer who slept beside it, the same thing it has been saying since the first human sat beside it and heard it and felt, in the sound of it, something that could not be put quite into words but that has been unmistakable. That was the word home before home becomes a specific place. The stars on the ceiling are turning very slowly, the way sleep turns, the way time turns when you have released your grip on it and let it move on its own pace, which is a pace slower and more generous than the pace you specifically asked yourself to keep. The incense that dried on your skin during preparation is still present, very faint now, barely a trace, just enough to be the quality of the air rather than a distinct smell, just enough to continue communicating the thing it communicated during the evening rituals: openness, readiness, the particular quality of attention that the temple requires, and that sleep, at its deepest, resembles. The hypostyle hall is silent. The columns stand in their darkness, their carvings invisible but present. All that accumulated meaning existed in the stone without needing to be read. Meaning does not require a reader to exist. It exists in the stone the way the river exists in the dark, continuously, quietly, without performance. In the outer courtyard, the youngest priests are deeply asleep on their mats. Their dreams are already beginning. moving through the landscapes of symbol that the tradition had given them to dream in. They will remember some of these dreams in the morning and forget others. What they forget will not entirely be gone. It will have done its work in the interior, even without its leaving a trace in the memory. The sacred lake holds the moon in its dark water, still, perfect, the reflection as real as the original, and in the absolute stillness of the deepest hours of the night, impossible to say which is which. This is the hour when language begins to become unnecessary. Everything that is needed to be said has been said. Everything has been needed to be understood has been, in whatever the way things are understood at this level of the mind, understood. What remains now is simply the experience itself, the warmth of the body against the mat, the coolness of the stone, the faint fire in the niche in the dark, the quiet, the river, the stars. The ancient Egyptian word for the state of sleep, deep intentional sleep, was nidersta, sweet sleep. Not sweet in the sense of pleasant, though it was that, sweet in the sense of the right concentration of a thing, the way honey is sweet because it was the right density of everything that the bee gathered, the right reduction of everything the flower offered, the right form of something complex that takes when it's complete. Sweet sleep. Sleep that was the completion of waking rather than its interruption. Sleep that was correct and the necessary the next thing, the thing that waking had been building toward, the thing without which the morning could not be fully what the morning was supposed to be. Your breathing is slow, your body is heavy, the lamp is burning, the river is moving, the stars are turning. Somewhere in the deep interior of the temple, in the sanctuary where the gods rest in the sealed naos and the priest lies on the reed mat, and the boundary between dreaming and not dreaming is as thin as the walls between this world and the next. Something is being exchanged, not something visible, not something that will be in the morning news or the academic record or any form that the waking world recognizes as significant. Something interior, something that moves at the speed of dreams, which is a speed that has no unit of measurement, that cannot be converted into any other scale, something that will be present in the morning as a quality, a slight adjustment in how the world looks, a small shift in the proportion of things, a changed relationship between what you are and what you're capable of. The priests knew of this. They built their buildings to make it possible. They spent their lives learning to enter the state in which it could occur. And every night, in every temple along the Nile, from the great complex at Karnak to the south to the Delta temples in the north, in every room where a lamp burned and a mat lay on the floor, and a prepared and quiet mind released its grip on itself and consented to receive what the dark had to offer. Every night, this exchange was occurring. Thousands of years of it. Thousands of years of human beings lying down in the dark and trusting that something would come, that something coming. Not always what was expected, not always what was asked for. Sometimes something better, sometimes something harder, sometimes something that could only be understood years later when its meaning finally arrived in the moment of ordinary life and was recognized. You are part of this, not metaphorically, not in the sense of polite analogy, genuinely part of it. Your sleeping mind is the same kind of mind that lay in the sanctuary 3,000 years ago, the same architecture, the same deep structures, the same collective conscious, with its same archetypes and its same tendency to speak in images and symbols and the language of myth rather than the language of the ordinary day. The temple may be gone or standing in ruins in the Egyptian desert, visited by tourists who take photographs of the Hypostyle hall and feel something they cannot quite name and walk carrying it with them without knowing what it is. But the part of you that the temple was built to address, that part is still entirely intact, still doing what it was always done, still moving through its nightly journey, still capable, when the conditions are right, of receiving what the darkness has to offer. Let the conditions be right tonight. Let your body be the mat on the floor. Let the room around you be the sanctuary. Let the darkness be the darkness that holds everything that needs holding. And let whatever comes in the deep hours come in peace. The lamp is burning. The river is moving. The stars are turning. Sleep now, sweet sleep. The temple holds you. The darkness holds you. The river says what it has always said. Sleep, sleep, sleep.